Good day, students. Today, my discussion is going to address what makes a global masterpiece. Now, there's a reason why I separate this out from the general discussion of what makes a masterpiece, because of the fact that the masterpiece issue can be overlaid on top of many different cultures, and that might change from culture to culture to a degree. But what I wanted to do is to address why I chose to do in this particular course a global discussion. And what do I even mean by global? One of the things to think about is what we're starting with in the text that I chose. The main textbook that we are reading has all excerpts from this book by Michael Campen O'Reilly. And if you notice, the term of the title is Art Beyond the West. So we have to think a little bit about, well, art, we already tried to define a little bit. And now we have to think about, well, beyond, why does it have to be beyond? And so we're going to talk about why it is worthwhile to separate out the art that is not of the West. And then we actually have to even start, maybe before that, with defining, well, what is the West? And why are we going to work outside of those boundaries? So, what is the West in cultural terms? Typically, that term West, with a capital W, means Europe and its colonial extensions. So that means the parts of Europe and any parts of the world that they spent a fair bit of time in as a part of an extended version of their own culture. Now, in this way, though, I will say there are times in our class we do look at some of the colonial aspects of Europe precisely because of how it oftentimes reflects parts of the local culture as well as parts of the European culture. But the key thing that we're going beyond in our discussion is Europe. Now, the borders of the West are not always distinct. Because they do reach out of what we think of as the traditional geographical boundaries of Europe. And so we will find some overlap happening in some of our discussions in a way that's not a bad thing, but just really kind of complicates and makes more interesting and complex some of the discussions that we're going to be having. So when we look at this map here of the world and where we will be covering primarily the topics of our discussions, we will be looking at the art primarily of Africa and of Asia, along with a little bit of areas of the Pacific as well. So why we're essentially not going to be touching upon Europe, and we're not going to be touching upon North America as a way of extension, particularly for North America, being seen as, at least in its beginnings, a part of the colonial extension of Europe and Britain and Spain and France especially. And the same also, too, for South America. And it's not to say, of course, that there aren't some incredibly interesting cultures to address and to deal with in those areas, but just as a way to focus, we're going to be primarily looking at areas of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, in part because it's just further away from us. It's further from our culture here in the United States and allows us to open our eyes even more. Now, I want to give you a concept of this idea of the West coming from the eyes, in fact, of someone of a native culture here in the United States, or what is now the United States, because when he was first living in this region and his people were first living in this region, it was not the United States to him. This is a drawing by an artist named Woha, and it's an image of himself, standing, as it says, between two worlds in the year 1875. And it shows how he perceives of himself in relationship to the Western European world that has come into North America and the native culture that's a part of his background and his people. So first of all, if you look at this drawing, it shows at the top an image of the sun the stars and the moon as a way of showing how nature is essentially overseeing him, helping look over him as he stands here. To his right, he reaches out with a weapon. It's kind of hard to actually be certain what that weapon is, but my guess is it's some kind of spear-like weapon. Perhaps also related perhaps to some kind of bow and arrow. It's a little bit hard to tell that, but what is very apparent is this. This is clearly a buffalo here. And that buffalo is kind of interacting with him by spitting upon him. But what's stopping that almost charge happening is this kind of small version of a teepee that's sitting right here with a very minute herd of buffalo reflected here right at the right foot of Woha. And what these represent is essentially the Plains Indians, the culture that he descends from, what would have been very important to them, which is the manner of their living, which was focused on the teepee, which was considered to be a more flexible kind of habitation that you could pick up and take with you, when you were following herds around, because that was the basis of their lives, was to follow the herds around. So this was a very important part of his native background. But reflected here on the left is his interaction with and his understanding of Western European background, because that's a new culture that he is interacting with. He's in not always a positive way, certainly, but it's showing here at his left foot a framed house with a roof and windows and a fireplace, kind of chimney sticking up. And these squares at the base of the house are representing the agricultural organization and the crops that are being grown by the people who live in this house. And then in addition, you have the animal who represents the cattle, who are the more domesticated animals that are part of the European culture and what is a part of their farming process. In his hand, then, he holds another tool, which again is a little bit hard to see. I'm not positive if that is a gun or rifle, but it definitely, what he's trying to do is to represent a difference across these cultures that he sees separating, or maybe that he is the separator of. He's between those two cultures, and he's having to learn about this culture of the West while still remaining loyal to that culture of his native land. So this idea that there is something to learn from people's native cultures that is not the culture that's coming from Europe, but something that's an important part of whatever their heritage is essentially what this drawing represents. So that's something I wanted to bring up to emphasize this idea of the global art beyond the West. And that even though we are in North America here, we still are dealing with another kind of art form that is, one could